Hi, thanks for joining in. I'm Pablo, and I'm here to talk to you about Flutter and mostly my experience while I was learning it as someone who has been doing iOS for a while. So, to tell you a little bit about myself, as I just said, I've been doing iOS for some time. Went from the time we didn't even have Arc, and we had to be careful uh, with the release and the retains, and then of course jumped into the Swift bandwagon. And last year I was very happy when SwiftUI was launched and released. But also, in addition of doing iOS and mobile, I've done quite a bit before, and also during the my times on iOS of backend development, mostly on Java, but also a little bit on a few other languages. I have also done stuff with web, JavaScript, and CSS and all the stuff. So I'm a bit of a full stack developer, if you will, but really my heart is very close to mobile and to Swift. I really like it's a language that I really enjoy. So most of my experience in my talk today are gonna be from that perspective. Someone who likes and enjoys using Swift quite a lot. Um, from 9 to 5, I work for a consultancy company as a lead consultant. And outside that, I work on personal apps and also do some apps for clients. And again, all this talk is a lot based on my opinions and my perceptions and how I see learning like a sort of a multi-platform solution like Flutter. So you might be asking yourself, if you've done iOS for a while, where did you end up picking up Flutter? Well, I can tell you that I found myself kind of what you see on this picture, between a rock and a hard place. So someone approached me and they asked me if I could help them with an app. And quickly, when we started chatting and trying to understand what they needed, we realized that they didn't have anything at all. We had to do everything from the scratch. So it was just myself at the beginning. I got the help from a friend and colleague. But we had to do everything. So we had to start thinking and implementing backend services for the app. We had to do the web console, and we had to do the iOS app. So with all the stuff that I'm mentioning, I was sort of okay. Still, for a POC, it's a lot of work to do for two people. The idea was to have this app, which is mostly like a sort of an enterprise app, or if you will, like it's not up that's going to go to the App Store. It's mostly internal for this client. But I found that we also needed to have an Android app. So I haven't done much with Android before. And then I quickly realized that I wasn't going to be able to do everything. So I started looking into multi-platform solutions for mobile. And pretty much I narrowed it down to Flutter and React Native. And I'm going to explain later why I ended up picking up Flutter. But I decided to go with Flutter. Spoiler alert. So let me tell you a little bit about Flutter then. So Flutter is a multi-platform solution, basically a framework that it was released and is created and maintained by Google. And it's not just another mobile multi-platform solution like, maybe Cordova or maybe the more evolved ones such as React Native. I would say the main difference that it has when you compare with the other ones is the good performance. It actually has a very good performance, and it can be very efficient rendering views. The language that you use when you are writing in Flutter is Dart. It's not a very well-known language. It was also created by Google, and it's very close what Java is. It's very similar, maybe not as verbose as Java is, and it's a bit more far away from what Kotlin is. So it's not as nice as Kotlin. Has a bit of verbosity, and you pretty much create classes for everything, similar to Java. So not much of a value types in there. The UI, when you specify your UI, is basically in a declarative way. So most of the comparisons that I'm going to do in the talk today are going to be against SwiftUI, because it is a lot closer. Like if it was talking about UI kit, it's probably too different compared to what you can specify or write using Flutter. The way that it can achieve this very high performant and very smooth animations in general is basically because it behaves like a game, if you will. It renders everything using OpenGL, and it was doing that the same as on iOS, but very recently they migrated to Metal. So pretty much everything that gets rendered on the screen gets rendered using Metal on iOS. There's all the complexity of the multi-thread environment is completely hidden. So the way that you get to see and run asynchronous operations is by using promises and async await. And they're really going like full on. So they have better support for web apps. So the same code that you write when you're writing a Flutter app, you can render or generate a web app, and they've introduced alpha support for desktop apps, kind of like what you have with Electron apps. So if we go a little bit more into the architecture and how it looks like, so I was saying before, you specify and declare your widgets by using Dart, and you basically say how your app is going to look like, pretty similar to what SwiftUI is. Then that gets turned into Flutter Engine directives, which when you compile, depending if you're compiling on iOS or if you're compiling on Android, is going to be doing Metal for iOS, or as I was saying before, OpenGL for Android. But of course, as you know, there are a lot of cases when you actually need to access to native APIs, such as, for example, call location. So for that case, you need to write channels. So channels basically allow you to specify asynchronous functions, which in the iOS side will be central dispatch, right? To invoke APIs and then return the result on a block. And then going a little bit more in why I ended up deciding for Flutter. One of the main reasons is my preference is normally any strongly typed language. Yes, I know JavaScript. You can have the TypeScript, which is a little bit more close to a strongly typed language, but being my experience before with Java, I thought it was going to be easier for me to grasp Dart. And the second reason was because I wanted to have something as smooth as possible. And I found very interesting that it just renders directly using the GPU versus what you have in React Native, which is using JavaScript core. In terms of the standard library, or what you basically get when you're trying to write an app in Flutter and in React Native. In React Native, you need lots of dependencies for every little thing you want to do. On Flutter, maybe you don't need that many, but you still need quite a lot. Just to give you an example, formatting dates, I had to import a library. So stuff that you normally get for granted in Swift, you need libraries. In terms of the paradigm that you use to program it, Flutter is pretty open, whether you want to use a sort of a reactive way of programming or not, versus React Native, which is more geared to a sort of a reactive paradigm. And on the popularity, as you probably heard, React Native is very, very popular, but Flutter is gaining a lot of traction. And in terms of the native integration, and by that I mean things like, for example, accessibility or being able to do these multitask side apps on iPad, has pretty decent support in general. It also supports dark mode, versus in React Native, you actually need to implement a few of that stuff. And then, as I said before, whenever you need to access to any native API, you write channels in Flutter, and React Native, you use these bridges, which I didn't get much into them and to the bridges, but I heard that they can be a bit complicated sometimes. So once you decide to use Flutter, you pretty much want to integrate it into your app, and there are a couple of options that you can take. So the first one is if you don't want to hand over all the control to Flutter. And this is the option that I ended up taking. I wanted to have the open door to do something like maybe widgets, or I don't know, any more native stuff, being able to still do it in Swift. So one of the ways that you can do it is with Flutter, you generate a embedded framework, or you can also generate a static library, and you integrate it into your existing app. And in the case of Android, of course, you generate an Android module. So the way that you get access to whatever the views that you have defined in Flutter is through a Flutter view controller that gets exposed into your iOS app. And this can be added as a child view controller, or it can be presented standalone. And in terms of any other functions that you want to call, you can also access to the Flutter engine and directly do these calls through channels. The other option that you have, which is the option that I would imagine someone who hasn't done any iOS native or any Android native at all would take, is giving it full control to Flutter. So by this, I mean with a Flutter command, you create your project, and it automatically generates an Xcode project and an Android Studio project. Of course, you still need to understand all the Xcode intricacies and all the Android intricacies, like things, for example, like code signing and all the release cycle to the App Store, all the sort of stuff. You still need to do it through Xcode. And of course, you still need Xcode to compile, because as I was saying, you write it in Dart, but what it ended up compiling is into binaries for iOS and binaries for Android. And in terms of the channels, as I was saying, they're all asynchronous. So you basically write asynchronous functions to access to any native API that you might need. So this is how it looks like from the code perspective. So pretty much everything, it's a widget. And by default, the moment you use an app, it tries to use the material look and feel, which is something that I'm normally not too keen to have on iOS apps. I'm someone who prefers to have more sort of a native or more platform look-like widgets. There is a way around that. I'm gonna explain later. But you can see that it's actually quite similar to what you can do in SwiftUI. So you have your app. Your app is even a widget, right? And for example, the app bar that you can see in there, you just specify the title, and then within that home sort of scaffold screen, you can specify your body, and in the body, of course, you can start adding widgets. So for example, I just added there a center widget that has a text. The only thing is it's not the same as SwiftUI, where you can start adding multiple views. So if you want to have something more complex, like maybe many widgets, you might be adding another widget that allows you to add multiple widgets within. So as a comparison, this is how SwiftUI looks like when you use the app protocol announced for iOS 14 and with the trialing closures. Of course, you would never have an app within one file, but I thought it was an interesting sort of comparison. So you can see SwiftUI is a lot more succinct in the way you can specify things. So there are a few other things that you can also do with Flutter. In terms of all the iconography, they come together with the Flutter framework. It's very similar to what we have on the iOS land with the SF symbols. So you will normally add them as widgets. As I was saying, everything is widgets. So there is a widget, and then you specify the icon name. And you can do things like set the color, set the background color, or size, stuff like that. In terms of the layout model, uses a flexbox layout model, and as I was saying earlier in my little code in there, if you want to add multiple widgets within a specific widget, you add these special ones that we have, which is columns or rows or spacers, which they can be very similar to what we have on the iOS side, such as H-stacks, V-stacks, and spacers. It also allows you to have to keep a state in your main widget, and so they have this difference between stateless and stateful widgets. This again is similar to what we have with the state property wrapper in SwiftUI, but it's not as powerful because there's not such a thing like observable objects or all those nice features that we have in SwiftUI, and there is nothing like combine, of course. And if you want to get around in terms of maybe not having your app looking like a material app from the get-go, they have these Cupertino widgets, which are a pixel by pixel, very close imitation to all the UIKit views. If you really look very close, you might notice some differences, especially on animations. For example, when you're pushing a view controller into a navigation controller. But they can be very, very similar. So for my app, I use those on the iOS side, and I stick to the material sort of a look and feel on the Android side. They have very limited support for if and for statements within the definition of the widgets, kind of like what we have in the embedded DSLs, and they actually got pretty powerful now in SwiftUI. So in terms of the Dart side, basically it's just one-liners. So just an if statement with just one-liner inside. And in case of the for, it's again for statement with just one-liner. The animations, as I was saying, can be very smooth, but they are not as powerful as what you can achieve with SwiftUI and UIKit, of course. But it has very good accessibility support. So I was actually making sure that, when you change the text size, also when you have the visual impediment sort of dictation and screen reader, all that works pretty well in general. So with all this stuff that we get with Flutter, and a lot of companies coming and saying, why don't we just use multi-platform from now on? And I read a lot, and I hear a lot of people saying, is native development over? No, definitely no, not at all. I think things like, for example, things like, for example, Swift and SwiftUI are really good, and they can really accelerate the implementation of your apps. Of course, in my case, as I was saying, just two-person. I was the only one doing all the mobile. I ended up opting for Flutter, but if I had a little bit more time, probably I would be doing SwiftUI. And I actually started rewriting just to see the differences, my few bits and pieces of the POC in SwiftUI. So as I was saying, there are quite a few cases where you still want to stick to native development. The big one, the main reason that I would say is when you need access to advanced hardware features. So in a lot of cases, if your app is highly geared toward using Bluetooth and a lot of different native features, NFC, all that sort of stuff, it will be a lot easier to just directly call the APIs rather than to have these intermediaries in between. Of course, if you want to have a highly customization of your transitions and animations, you can see that Flutter can be, and in general, a lot of these multi-platform solutions can be very limiting. You don't have as much freedom and as much access to advanced stuff such as core animation as you have on the native area. When you want to leverage on new features or APIs, so for example, we got the widgets now on iOS 14. Definitely need to use SwiftUI for that. But say also some other APIs that you want to use as well. Or for example, if you want your app to support multi-window, it gets a lot easier just to do it natively. So to me, all the points that I was mentioning before, they all resume to, if you really want to differentiate your app from the rest, you probably want to still stick to native. I think it's a very compelling reason. Some other things that I consider is if you have a critical app with a large adoption, we all know that trying to understand crash reports and diagnose where the crash is happening can be very difficult even with Swift and native programming. Imagine when you add in on top of that an extra layer of unknowns. It's very difficult to find out what is going on, and especially to debug. And of course, if you want to support tvOS or watchOS, definitely you need to go to native. Or also, and why not, if your app is going to be only available for iOS, I would definitely go for native. I don't think it's worth just limiting yourself using a multi-platform solution. So how did all this project ended up going up for me? Well, I'd say pretty good. We were able to finish the POC. They are now testing it. So we did everything: backend, front end, web, and the app. But I found myself missing a few things. So a few more comparisons and stuff that maybe you might be missing if you are writing using Flutter. So I'd say Swift was the main one. I really like Swift. As I said, I've used a few languages: Java, Go, little bit of JavaScript, and I quite like Swift. So stuff like guards and if let statements. In a lot of cases, I found myself thinking, oh, maybe I can use a guard here, and remembering that I can't use it. All the power that you have with enums and switch cases, or stuff like trailing closures, as you saw in my previous slide, or protocol extensions, value types, all the sort of stuff. And believe it or not, Xcode. Yeah, I know it's a stretch, but stuff like inspectors and being able to drag and drop things from the object libraries and how you can wrap things now in SwiftUI. In a lot of cases, I do it with Xcode, and I sort of miss that a little bit. SwiftUI, of course, all the things like preview providers, which I think are pretty cool, and they allow you to basically just say or specify how your view will look like with all the mock stuff without just navigating into that view. So in Flutter, you do have this hot reloading, which we got now with SwiftUI in a way, but I quite like the preview providers because they allow you to just directly have different visuals of your view, different instantiations of your view, and you can really iterate and refine your view. And things, of course, like modifiers or, as I said before, advanced animations and all the flexibility that you can get in transitions. I think I mentioned before, Combine is something that I found missing myself quite a lot. And also this direct access that we have to all the amount of huge APIs that we got on iOS in general on the Apple platforms. So in a lot of cases, I rarely find any reason to use third-party libraries, and I went to the opposite, just using libraries for everything. So this is how I see the state of play. So on the consultancy side, I've seen a lot of companies asking and trying to drop their native apps and just trying to go open, trying to go to the multi-platform. But I still think there will always be native. But Flutter, I think, is a very viable alternative for getting apps very quickly out of the door, especially POCs, and especially if you don't really have time to learn one of the two platforms. As I showed you before, Google is investing heavily in Flutter. So I think what they're trying to do is they want it to be the React Native of the mobile and the Electron of the desktop. And they have tons of tutorials and really a lot of material. Yes, SwiftUI is probably going to be the go-to platform, the go-to language for multi-platform, but within Apple only. So this is a far-fetched dream that I have. I like alternatives. I really like to have multiple ways of doing things. So it'd be great to see Apple just coming up with an alternative. Why they couldn't, for example, maybe implement the SwiftUI engine in OpenGL for other platforms that are not Apple platforms, and then keep the closed source implementation for Apple platforms. As I said, I'd like to have that alternative. I don't really think it's going to happen, but it'd be really good to get to have these high quality apps, and also, being able to use Swift when writing multi-platform apps. Okay, so wrapping up, as I said before, Flutter is fairly easy in general to grasp because it has this highly declarative way of specifying your widgets. And so the learning curve is in general fairly quick. It can be very efficient, and you can get like a very nice frame rate, especially when you're doing scrolling and stuff like that. So it fulfills the promise of a multi-platform up to a point. Of course, for a lot of things, you still need to use libraries, and you need to write channels if you want to use, I don't know, Touch ID, or you want to access to the keychain, or you want to access to the user defaults, stuff like that. You always need to still use channels. It can be great for POCs if you want to get something out to market or something done very quickly. But I think it's still not the best option if you want to have a top-notch app that needs deep integration with the platform. And I still think that Swift and SwiftUI are really, really good and a very compelling case for rapid development and POC creations. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for joining and for watching my talk. Up to you, Matt.